Celeste Mercer laughed the moment she saw it. Standing at the edge of Archer Hayes's property on a bright gray morning in coastal Oregon, she looked at the rows of rusted metal stacked along the fence line, the twisted brackets propped against the shed wall, the sorted trays of bolts and alloy fragments lined up on weathered shelving, and she laughed the easy laugh of someone who has never had to take anything seriously for very long. To her, it was exactly what it looked like, a yard full of salvage, the self-soothing project of a man who had nothing better to hold on to. Her assistant Delaney stood a half-step behind her, clipboard pressed to her chest, saying nothing. The locals who had gathered to watch the Mercer Aerotech entourage pass through town watched the exchange from a careful distance. Nobody corrected the CEO. Nobody told her what Archer Hayes had actually been doing out on that beach every single morning for the past 2 years. But 30 days after she laughed, the pile she had called worthless scrap would lead a sonar camera to a wreckage site 63 miles offshore, surface the truth buried inside a falsified investigation, and force an entire corporation to answer for what it had chosen to forget. If you have ever believed in something no one else could see yet, stay with this one until the very end. Gray Harbor, Oregon sat close enough to the Pacific that the salt air had worked its way into every wooden porch, every rusted gate latch, every vehicle left outdoors longer than a season. The town was small but not quiet in the way people imagine small towns to be. It had its arguments, its old grievances, its well-worn opinions about who was doing well and who had let themselves go. Archer Hayes fell into the second category in most people's estimation. He was 39 years old and thin in the way of someone who ate, when he remembered to, with hands roughed from outdoor work and eyes that held the particular stillness of a person who had decided long ago not to explain himself to anyone. Every morning before sunrise, he walked the beach south of the harbor with an old wheeled cart, collecting metal debris washed up by the tide. He wore the same canvas jacket regardless of temperature, carried a waterproof notebook in the front pocket, and worked with the quiet, methodical focus of someone following a system nobody else could see. The people of Gray Harbor had formed their conclusions early and stuck to them. A handful genuinely believed Archer was selling salvage by weight, scraping through on whatever the sea threw back. Others, the ones who remembered the Mercer Flight 407 accident 2 years prior, suspected the collection was something stranger, a private grief ritual they were too polite to name directly. Children in the neighborhood had given his backyard a nickname that spread through the elementary school and eventually reached the parents: the Metal Graveyard. Archer's 9-year-old daughter Piper had come home from school one afternoon and told him plainly what the other kids were saying. He had looked at her for a long moment and asked if she agreed with them. Piper had thought about it with the particular seriousness she brought to everything and said no, she thought it looked more like a library. Archer had smiled at that, the rare full kind, and said she was exactly right. Inside the shed behind the house, the collection was anything but random. Each piece had been cleaned, photographed, cataloged with a date, a GPS coordinate approximation, a compass bearing for the direction the tide was running when Archer found it, an estimated corrosion rating on a scale he had developed himself, and a material classification based on alloy composition he identified through a combination of visual examination, magnet response, and weight testing against known samples. The shed held 12 long shelving units, each divided into labeled trays, and along the back wall a large corkboard covered in a hand-drawn map of the coastline, with colored pins and fine thread connecting locations. Piper sometimes sat on an overturned crate and did her homework in there while her father worked. She had asked him once, in the unself-conscious direct manner of a child who has not yet learned to frame questions politely, whether he was going to find out the truth about the plane. He had not answered immediately. He had kept his eyes on the fragment he was cleaning and said that if the sea returned enough pieces, he would be able to hear the story it was trying to tell. He had been an aerospace materials engineer at Mercer Aerotech for 11 years before the accident. He had worked on fatigue testing protocols, stress fracture analysis, thermal cycling evaluations for structural components. He knew how metal failed and why and under what conditions different failure signatures appeared. He had left the company in the months following the loss of Mercer Flight 407, a prototype fuel-efficient business jet that had vanished over open water during a moderate storm on a test route. The official investigation had concluded that pilot Garrett Holloway had deviated from the approved test corridor and responded incorrectly to a system destabilization event. Garrett had been Archer's closest friend for 16 years. Archer had flown with him on smaller aircraft, had watched him run pre-flight checks with a precision that bordered on ritual, had never once seen him cut a corner or override a caution without logging it first. The official conclusion had felt, from the first time Archer read it, like a story built around the answer someone had already decided on. On a Tuesday morning in the third week of October, Archer's cartwheel caught in a tide-pooled rock and he stopped to work it free, and when he looked down at what had snagged alongside it, he saw a fragment of formed alloy plate, roughly the size of his palm, with one smooth edge and one fractured edge and a series of stamped characters along the smooth side, most of them ground down to near invisibility by 2 years of ocean abrasion. Under good light with a magnifying loupe, 2 characters remained, M.A. He held it without moving for close to a minute. Then he placed it in a separate tray he had been keeping empty for exactly this possibility, walked it to the shed, and set it under the examination lamp. The corrosion pattern, the alloy composition visible at the fracture edge, the specific anti-corrosion coating underneath the wear, all of it was consistent with structural plating used in the Mercer 407 series. He did not allow himself to feel anything about it yet. He only wrote the date, the time, the precise location, and the words "first confirmed candidate" in his notebook. Fairfree. Celeste Mercer arrived in Gray Harbor 11 days later with a communications team, 2 members of the City Planning Committee, and a detailed presentation for the proposed Mercer Coastal Aviation Hub, a project the company had been building toward as its primary public rehabilitation effort in the wake of Flight 407's unresolved cloud over the brand. She was 35, polished in the manner of someone trained from childhood to occupy rooms with authority, and she had learned early that the fastest way to control a narrative was to keep moving forward until no one could find the previous chapter. The Coastal Hub project was a forward motion. It was investment, jobs, infrastructure, and most critically, a reason for the local press to write about Mercer Aerotech in connection with something other than a missing jet. The site survey took the group within 200 yards of Archer's property. Delaney, who had done the standard background research on key community stakeholders, recognized him before Celeste did and said his name quietly. Archer Hayes, formerly a senior engineer in materials testing at the company's Portland facility, resigned 18 months after the 407 incident. Celeste looked at the yard with its organized rows of salvaged metal and felt the specific impatience of someone whose carefully composed public appearance has been interrupted by something untidy. She said, clearly enough for the people nearest her to hear, that a competent engineer builds aircraft and a man who has given up collects the wreckage. It was the kind of remark that feels clever in the moment and lands poorly when repeated in daylight. Several people heard it. The comment moved through the assembled group in the way such things do. Archer was on his front steps cleaning a section of aluminum framing with a wire brush when Celeste approached from the survey group. He did not stand. He continued working at the same pace and looked up when she was close enough to make avoiding eye contact a choice rather than an oversight. she asked, with the deliberate poise of someone unused to having to ask anything twice, whether he had given thought to how the state of his property affected the surrounding neighborhood during a period when the town was actively seeking investment. He answered that every piece in the yard had a position it had earned by surviving the ocean, and that placement mattered more than appearance. She smiled at that the way someone smiles at a response that has not addressed the actual question. She said that a pile of rust did not become evidence simply because it was stacked neatly. Archer set the brush down. He looked at her steadily and asked whether she had ever read the original 407 investigation file herself, or only the version the board of directors had prepared for her review. The question landed differently than she had anticipated. Her expression shifted in a way she did not fully control, a brief tightening around the jaw, a flicker of something that was not quite annoyance, but was related to it. She said the investigation was concluded, that pilot error had been established, that families had been compensated, and that reopening wounds served no one. Archer did not raise his voice. He said the ocean had not reached the same conclusion. Then he picked up the brush again. Celeste left with her group. Delaney remained 2 steps behind her, as always, but her pace slowed slightly as she passed the shed, and through the half-open door she caught a glimpse of the corkboard map, the annotated trays, the systematic precision of it. She filed the image away without saying anything. Later that afternoon, Archer pulled a second piece from the net of an old crab trap a fisherman had left to dry at the south end of the harbor. The metal was larger than the first fragment, and when he examined the fracture surface under light, he found burn patterning that curved from interior to exterior. Not impact damage, not abrasion from a water strike, thermal distress originating from inside the component. He sat with that for a long time before he wrote anything down. 2 years earlier, Mercer Flight 407 had been a milestone. The aircraft was a prototype designed around a new fuel reduction system the company had been developing for 3 years, intended as the centerpiece of a commercial licensing deal worth several $100 million. The test flight was a standard endurance route over open water, chosen specifically because the ocean corridor provided isolation from populated areas and clean telemetry without ground interference. Garrett Holloway had been selected as lead test pilot because of his record, 12 years without a single deviation note in his flight logs, commendations from 2 separate aviation safety organizations, and the kind of institutional trust that takes a career to build. The aircraft had disappeared approximately 1 hour and 14 minutes into the test window during a weather system that most meteorologists would have classified as moderate. Signals became intermittent, then stopped. No substantial wreckage had been recovered in the official search, which had concentrated on a sector 40 miles northeast of Gray Harbor, based on the last transponder coordinates. The official report, released 5 months after the disappearance, ran to 230 pages. Its central conclusion was that Holloway had taken the aircraft outside the approved test envelope in response to weather, and had then made a series of incorrect control inputs that compounded an instability event into an unrecoverable situation. The language was precise, bureaucratic, and carefully constructed to sit at the edge of explicitness without crossing fully into it. Archer had read it 4 times in the weeks after its release, and each time he had returned to the same sections, specifically the appendix detailing pre-flight component status, where 3 entries had been rendered in summary form only, with supporting data marked as proprietary under the company's internal review classification. Those entries covered the auxiliary pressure management system, the thermal regulation coupling in the secondary engine bay, and a component listed only by internal designation with no accompanying technical specification. Laurel Hayes had known why. Archer's wife had worked as a data analyst in the component performance division at Mercer Aerotech for 6 years. And in the weeks following the accident, she had grown progressively quieter, spending hours in the evenings at her laptop with a focused intensity that she deflected whenever Archer asked about it. She was protecting him, he understood later. She did not want to tell him what she had found until she had enough of it to be unassailable. But the stress had compounded. She had a congenital heart condition she managed carefully, and the sustained anxiety of knowing what she knew and not being able to release it had accelerated something that might otherwise have remained stable for decades. She died on a Thursday morning 14 months after the accident, and she left behind, tucked inside the back cover of a notebook she kept in her desk drawer, a single page of handwritten component codes with a notation beside one of them that read, "Not on the approved manifest Vaughn signed off." The notebook was the only instrument Archer had. No system access, no legal standing, no investigative authority. What he had was the knowledge of how metal behaved under specific conditions, and the patience to let the ocean do over years what he could not do through any institutional channel. He had stood at the edge of the water on the morning after Laurel's funeral, with Piper asleep in the house behind him, and made the quiet, undramatic decision to keep going. Not with noise, with attention. Now, back in the present, he placed the burn-patterned fragment beside the first piece and opened Laurel's notebook to the page with the component codes. The thermal profile he was looking at matched the characteristics of a pressure regulation assembly operating above its design threshold. According to the official report, that component had shown no anomalies prior to impact. According to the ocean floor, something had been very wrong with it before the aircraft ever hit the water. Piper knocked on the shed door and asked if he was coming inside for dinner. He said yes, 5 minutes. He looked at the corkboard, at the map, at the slow accumulation of pieces pointing toward a particular stretch of water no official search had ever examined. He pinned the new fragment into its position on the map and saw, for the first time, the rough triangle the 3 primary finds had formed. They were not scattered randomly. They were converging. Celeste did not sleep well after the survey visit. She lay in the hotel room, staring at the ceiling, with the specific restlessness of someone who has asked themselves a question they cannot immediately answer. What Archer had said about reading the file herself had not left her. She was not, by nature, a person who accepted incomplete information. She had built her management style around having more data than the room expected her to have. The idea that there was a version of the 407 investigation she had not seen was less unsettling than the ease with which she had assumed there was not. She called Delaney at 6 in the morning and asked for the full internal investigation archive, including all appendices and any attached data files. Delaney spent 2 hours working through the document management system and called back to report that 3 significant sections were locked under board-level access credentials, access that had been set by Vaughn Mercer, her father's brother, and the longest-serving member of the Mercer Aerotech Board of Directors, who had managed the company through the transition period following her father's retirement. The locked sections covered exactly the areas Archer had mentioned: component replacement records in the 72 hours before the flight, the auxiliary pressure system test logs, and the final sign-off documentation. Celeste called Vaughn directly. He answered on the second ring in the relaxed manner of someone who has had years to practice being unreadable. She asked why the investigation files had restricted access. He said the restrictions were standard practice for proprietary technical data, that they had been in place since the investigation concluded, and that reopening that archive at the precise moment Mercer Aerotech was pursuing a major public investment project would be, in his assessment, an act of corporate self-sabotage. He said it calmly, the way someone says something they have rehearsed so many times it no longer sounds rehearsed. He said the families had been compensated. He said the pilot's error was documented. He said some closures, once made, needed to remain closed. The call left Celeste with a feeling she recognized from years of negotiation, the feeling of someone managing her rather than speaking to her. She had grown up watching Vaughn manage her father the same way, steering conversations with the patient efficiency of a man who always knew where the exits were. She had always attributed it to experience. Standing now in a hotel room in a small coastal town, she was recalibrating that attribution. She asked Delaney to go see Archer Hayes. Not officially, not with a company card, just to look. Delaney arrived at the Hayes property late in the afternoon and knocked on the shed door. Archer opened it without apparent surprise. He looked at her for a moment and said he had been expecting someone from Mercer, though he had thought it would take longer. Delaney told him she was not there on the company's behalf. She said she had seen through the door the day before and wanted to understand what she had seen. Archer considered her for a moment, then stood aside and let her in. She spent 40 minutes in the shed. Archer walked her through the cataloging system without editorial commentary, explaining the methodology the way he would explain a chemical process. Here is the input, here is the protocol, here is what the output tells you. He showed her the GPS coordinate mapping, the corrosion gradient analysis, the directional drift modeling he had built by cross-checking his find locations against publicly available ocean current data. Delaney had a background in environmental compliance research before joining Mercer, and she understood enough of the methodology to recognize it was not amateur. She stood in front of the corkboard for a long time without speaking. Then Archer showed her the two primary fragments, the one with the partial MA stamp and the one with the interior burn patterning. He placed them under the examination light and let her look. She photographed both with her phone, asked if he minded, and he said no. She sent the images to Celeste without a message. She did not need to add one. Celeste received the photographs in her hotel room that evening. She looked at them on her phone screen for a long time. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and thought, with a clarity she had not expected, about the way she had laughed that morning 2 days ago. Not with pleasure. With the corrective recognition of someone who has been wrong in a way that costs more than convenience. She sent Delaney one message, "Tell him I'm coming tonight." Archer answered the door at 10:45 in the evening. Celeste had come alone, no driver, a rental car parked at the end of the lane, wearing a jacket rather than a coat, looking in the porch light like someone who had taken the trouble to approach without ceremony. He stepped back and let her in without asking why she had come. The kitchen table was covered in nautical charts and printed ocean current data. Piper was asleep. The house was quiet in the way of coastal houses at night, with the sound of water present but distant, constant, like a background frequency the rooms had adjusted to over time. Celeste stood near the table and looked at the charts and then looked at Archer and asked what he needed to prove what he believed. He told her, 30 days, access to the historical weather and sea state data from the 48 hours surrounding the accident, a component manifest from the pre-flight maintenance window, and a small survey vessel with sonar capacity for one trip. She told him those were significant resources to extend on the basis of coastal debris and personal conviction. He told her if she was afraid of what the ocean had to say, she could drive back to the hotel and keep reading the version of events her board had prepared for her. Celeste did not flinch at that. She was not a person who flinched easily, and she recognized a fair challenge when she heard one. She told him she would give him 30 days and what access she could pull without triggering board oversight on 2 conditions. The investigation had to remain private until there was something definitive to act on, and if his theory was wrong, he would stop. He said he accepted both conditions and had one of his own. If Garrett Holloway had been falsely blamed, Mercer Aerotech would issue a public correction, Not a settlement, not a statement of regret, a correction. Celeste did not answer immediately. She looked at the chart on the table and then at the photograph of Piper pinned to the cabinet near the window, and she said she would do what was right if the evidence warranted it. Within 3 days, Delaney had pulled weather buoy records from the National Oceanic Service, and Archer had begun the process of reverse modeling the drift paths of his found fragments, running each piece backward through the current maps to estimate where in the water column it would have originated. Dr. Meredith Langston, an independent aviation accident investigator with whom Delaney had a prior professional relationship, came down from Portland on the 5th day and spent an afternoon in the shed going through the methodology. She was methodical and unimpressed by anything that could not be supported, which was exactly what Archer needed. She told him the approach was sound, that she had seen similar drift analysis used in international maritime investigations, and that the key variable he would need to control for was the density differential between piece types. Heavier alloy components would have traveled more slowly and sunk earlier, meaning the actual impact site would be displaced from the debris cluster centroid in a direction opposite to the dominant current. Vaughn called Celeste on the 7th day and mentioned, in the careful way he managed everything, that he had heard she had been asking questions about old files. He expressed his concern with the warmth of someone who had long practice at disguising warnings as affection. He reminded her that the Coastal Hub project had 12 investors in active due diligence, and that institutional confidence was a fragile thing. He said the company had worked hard to rebuild its standing. Celeste told him she was doing routine operational review and ended the call. She stood afterward in the parking lot of a grocery store, where she had pulled over to take the call, and remained still for a few minutes, watching the coastal wind move through the trees at the lot's edge, thinking about what it meant that her own uncle monitored her questions. On the 19th day, Archer received a manufacturer's component listing that Delaney had obtained through a technical services request, framed as a maintenance compliance audit. He spent 6 hours cross-referencing the listing against Laurel's notebook. At 11:30 at night, he found the entry he had been looking for, a pressure regulation assembly for the auxiliary engine bay, requisitioned 4 days before the flight, with a part number that did not appear in the approved component manifest for the 407 series. It was not the component they had intended to use. It was a substitute, sourced faster and at significantly lower cost, and its testing certification covered a pressure threshold range that fell below the operating parameters of the 407's auxiliary system under full load. Whoever had approved that substitution had known, or should have known, that they were installing a component not rated for the conditions it would face. The approval signature on the requisition form was Von Mercer's. By the 23rd day, the corkboard had transformed. Where there had been scattered pins and disconnected thread, there was now a pattern that resolved itself clearly when Archer stood back far enough to see it whole. A curved arc of debris origin points, corrected for density and drift rate, all pointing back to an area of open water approximately 63 miles southwest of Gray Harbor. The official search had concentrated on a zone 40 miles to the northeast, the last transponder coordinates before signal loss. Archer's model placed the actual impact site more than 100 miles from where the recovery teams had looked. Dr. Meredith came back to review the final drift model and confirmed that the geometry was internally consistent. She said that if there was anything significant on the seafloor at that location, a sonar pass would identify it within a 6-hour window, given the right equipment. Celeste had already been quietly arranging access to a survey vessel through a marine research contact she had used for a previous harbor project. She told Archer they would have a 48-hour window before Vaughn's people noticed the vessel activity. The day before the planned departure, the situation broke open. Vaughn had been monitoring more than Celeste had realized. He called an emergency board meeting and presented what he described as a reckless unilateral investigation being conducted by the CEO without board authorization, driven by the claims of a former employee with documented history of emotionally compromised judgment following personal loss. He used those words, emotionally compromised. Several board members, those who had been at the company longest and whose financial stakes were most directly tied to the Coastal Hub project's success, aligned with his position. They wanted Celeste to issue a directive ending the investigation and instructing Archer to surrender his collected materials to company counsel. Celeste left the call and drove to Archer's house in the late afternoon. She told him what had happened without softening it. She said the board wanted to stop everything. Archer listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had lived 2 years being called unstable by the same institution that had let his friend die on a falsified manifest. He said he could absorb more of that. But Garrett Holloway's family had lived 2 years with the public record saying that a careful, experienced pilot had made careless mistakes and caused his own death. He said that was not something he was willing to let stand another day longer than necessary. Celeste looked at him in the cooling afternoon light in that quiet kitchen, and something shifted in how she was holding the whole situation. She had been navigating it as a CEO, calculating exposure and managing stakeholders and protecting its institutional interests even while trying to do the right thing. What Archer was describing was not a liability calculation. It was a matter of what the record said about a man who could not correct it himself. She called the board chair and invoked her executive authority to commission Dr. Meredith as an independent investigator, which carried different legal standing than a voluntary internal review. She authorized the survey vessel for 48 hours under that classification. Vaughn threatened consequences. Celeste told him to consult the company's legal team on the scope of CEO authority and ended the call. The night before departure, Piper gave her father a drawing she had made at school. A jet aircraft rising upward through water, emerging toward a pale surface with light above it. At the bottom of the image, in careful crayon letters, she had written, "Bring the truth home." They left the harbor at 4 in the morning, Archer and Celeste and Delaney and Dr. Meredith, on a 40-foot research vessel with a hull-mounted sonar array and a remotely operated camera unit. The weather was manageable. Low cloud, moderate swell, visibility limited but workable. Nobody spoke much on the way out. Archer stood at the bow for the first hour with Laurel's notebook in his jacket pocket, not reading it, just keeping it close. When they reached the primary search coordinates, Dr. Meredith took over the sonar station and began the first sweep. The ocean floor in that sector was irregular, cut with a series of narrow underwater ridges running roughly east to west, and the sonar image was cluttered with natural formation return signals that required careful interpretation. The first 90 minutes produced nothing distinct. Vaughn called Celeste's phone 3 times, and she declined each one. The board chair sent an email she did not open. The vessel moved through the pattern in slow, methodical passes, the way Archer had moved along the beach, the same pace, the same refusal to rush. On the 4th pass, Archer asked the pilot to adjust course 2 nautical miles to the southwest. He explained that the heaviest structural components, specifically the engine bay assembly casing, would have had a negative buoyancy profile that resisted the dominant northeastward current, meaning they would have traveled the shortest distance from the point of impact. Dr. Meredith agreed with the analysis. The pilot adjusted. The sonar return changed on the 3rd minute of the new heading. A large irregular mass reading at depth, partially obscured by a ridge formation consistent in cross-sectional profile with a mid-size aircraft fuselage lying on its side. Dr. Meredith looked at the reading for 30 seconds and then said quietly that they should deploy the camera. The ROV descended through 240 feet of water. The camera feed on the monitor was dark, except for the cone of the unit's own light, which moved through plankton clouds and drifting sediment, and the occasional geometry of rock structure. Then the light caught something flat and curved, and the operator adjusted the angle, and the camera tracked along the surface of it, moving past corrosion bloom and marine growth, until it found a recessed panel and the shadow of stamped lettering beneath the biological accumulation. The operator brought the camera closer, adjusted the light angle, enhanced the contrast on the monitor feed. The characters were worn but legible, M407. Celeste did not make a sound. She placed one hand flat on the console in front of her and looked at the screen with the expression of someone watching a thing they had believed to be possible become real in a way that cannot be taken back. Delaney put her hand over her mouth. Dr. Meredith began logging the coordinates immediately, speaking technical notation into her recorder in a steady voice that gave no indication of what this finding meant for anything beyond the formal documentation. Archer watched the screen. His face was still. The camera continued. They found the auxiliary engine base section separated cleanly from the main fuselage structure, lying approximately 30 feet away in a position consistent with a pre-impact separation event. The separation point showed the specific tearing pattern associated with a pressure failure from inside the component housing. Metal pushed outward from within, not inward from without. The aircraft had not come apart on contact with the water. Something had failed before it reached the water. Dr. Meredith identified the pattern immediately and said, without inflection, that this was inconsistent with the official incident description in every material respect. They recovered a secondary data recording unit and the pressure regulation assembly housing in a recovery operation that took 3 hours and required careful maneuvering against the ridge structure. When Archer examined the housing on deck, he turned it over until he found the component identification stamp and held it under the portable work light. The part number was the one from Laurel's notebook, the substitute component, the one not rated for the operating pressure of the 407 system, the one Von Mercer had signed off on. Celeste was standing 6 feet away. She was looking at the horizon. When she turned and saw the expression on Archer's face, she understood, without him saying anything, that it was over. The question had been answered. Garrett Holloway had not failed. He had been flying an aircraft with a compromised system and had done the only thing that a skilled and conscientious pilot could do. He had pointed the nose away from shore and held the aircraft aloft for as long as physics allowed. He had not made a mistake. He had died trying to protect everyone below him. On the return journey, in the early evening, Celeste stood at the rail beside Archer and said, without looking at him, that she had laughed at his scrap pile. He was quiet for a moment and then said she had not been laughing at the pile. She had been laughing at what it was trying to say. They stood in silence after that, watching the gray harbor lights appear on the shoreline ahead, small and steady against the descending dark. The secondary data recorder contained 51 minutes of recoverable flight data. Dr. Meredith spent 3 days processing it with a forensic audio and telemetry team she brought in from a firm she used for independent accident work. The results confirmed the sequence precisely. The auxiliary pressure system had exceeded its tolerance threshold at 1 hour and 9 minutes of flight time, triggering a cascade event that disabled the primary stabilization control input on the port side. Garrett Holloway had responded correctly to every warning indicator. His control inputs were within the recommended emergency procedure parameters. He had reduced altitude and turned the aircraft toward open water, away from the coastal communities below the test route. 5 minutes later, when the structural failure became terminal, the aircraft was over open ocean. The official report's conclusion, that he had made incorrect control decisions that worsened the situation, was not supported by a single data point in the recovered recorder. Delaney found 3 additional internal communications in the restricted archive, once Celeste compelled full access under her executive authority. An email from Laurel Hayes to the Safety Compliance Office, sent 8 days before the flight, flagging concerns about the substitute component's certification range. A response from a compliance coordinator saying the issue would be reviewed. A follow-up from Vaughn's executive assistant, closing the flag as reviewed and resolved, with no supporting documentation. Laurel's warning had been received, routed, and buried. She had known. She had tried. And the company had functioned, at Vaughn's direction, as though she had said nothing. Celeste scheduled the press conference for a Thursday morning. Vaughn arrived at the Mercer Aerotech regional office in Portland the night before and attempted to negotiate a private settlement framework that would allow the company to acknowledge certain procedural failures without making specific attributions. Celeste listened to his proposal in full and then told him that a company whose reputation rested entirely on a lie was not, in any meaningful sense, a company with a reputation to protect. She said it without cruelty and without heat. She said it the way someone says a thing that has become simply true. She stood at the podium the next morning and spoke without notes for 12 minutes. She said that Mercer Aerotech had been wrong when it closed the investigation into Flight 407 before the evidence was complete. She said that Garrett Holloway had been a skilled and careful pilot who had done nothing to cause the accident that killed him and had, in fact, in his final minutes, acted with a precision and a care for others that the company had failed to honor. She said that a non-certified component had been approved for installation on the aircraft without adequate review, that internal safety flags had been suppressed, and that the investigation had been shaped to assign responsibility to the pilot rather than to the institutional decisions that had preceded the flight. She used the word wrong 11 times in those 12 minutes. Not mistake, not oversight. Wrong. Jolene Holloway sat in the 3rd row with her 2 adult children. She was 61 years old and had spent 2 years living inside the particular isolation of a widow whose husband's name had been turned into a cautionary example. When Celeste said Garrett's name and said it clearly, and said what he had actually done on that flight, Jolene held completely still for a long moment. Then she let herself cry, not with collapse but with relief, the specific physical release of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. After the formal statement, Archer approached her. He carried a small fragment of the flight deck casing, cleaned and sealed in a clear case recovered from the debris site. He said it was from the part of the aircraft where Garrett had been. He said Garrett had not abandoned anything. He had fought for every possible second and had pointed the aircraft at water when the choice was no longer survivable. Jolene held the case and looked at it for a long time before she said anything. She said she had always known. That was all she said. Vaughn Mercer was removed from the board by unanimous vote at an extraordinary general meeting called 9 days after the press conference. He faced regulatory proceedings from the National Transportation Safety Board and a civil investigation from the Federal Aviation Administration related to the suppression of safety documentation and the falsification of the incident record. The Coastal Hub project was placed in indefinite suspension pending a complete review of all component sourcing and certification procedures. The financial consequences were significant. Celeste had been told repeatedly, in the days before the press conference, that a full public disclosure would cost the company a number she could not easily absorb. She had said that the cost of not disclosing it was one she could not absorb at all. A journalist asked Archer, outside the building after the conference, what had kept him going through 2 years of being dismissed and laughed at and called obsessed. He thought about it for a moment, looking at the street, and said that sometimes the truth does not come back whole. It comes back in pieces. You have to be willing to go to the water every day and wait for what the sea decides to return. The quote appeared in several news summaries by evening. Archer did not see most of them. He was already on his way back to Gray Harbor. The months that followed were neither simple nor entirely peaceful, but they had a quality of resolution that the years before them had lacked. Mercer Aerotech began the process of restructuring its safety division under a new framework that Celeste had developed with Dr. Meredith, serving as independent oversight chair. The framework required that all component substitutions on prototype aircraft receive dual certification review, that safety flags submitted by any employee be logged in a system accessible to the oversight chair and not suppressible by management, and that investigation reports on incidents involving company aircraft be made available in full to a review committee that included at least 2 members with no financial stake in the outcome. Celeste offered Archer a position as Director of Materials Safety with a substantial compensation package and a seat at the table she was trying to build. He thanked her and declined the title. He said the world he had left had taken enough from his family, and he was not ready to move back into it fully. But he said he would serve as an independent consultant on materials failure analysis and incident review, with one condition: that any report he submitted would be transmitted to the Oversight Committee without passing through executive review first. She agreed without hesitation. He recognized in that agreement that she was not trying to acquire him. She was trying to build something that required his presence to be credible, and she understood the difference. In Gray Harbor, the shed behind Archer's house was gradually changed. A portion of the recovered fragments, those whose provenance from Mercer Flight 407 had been formally documented by Dr. Meredith's investigation, were set aside for a different purpose. A local welder and fabricator named Connor Stiles worked with Archer over several weekends to construct a small permanent marker from the materials, a steel column set in concrete, fitted with a weatherproofed plaque. The plaque read in plain block letters, "In memory of Garrett Holloway and the crew of Mercer Flight 407. The truth returned in pieces. The memorial was placed at the edge of Archer's property, facing the ocean. A dedication was held on a Saturday morning in late spring, with no press invitation and no company delegation. Jolene Holloway came with her children and 2 of Garrett's former colleagues from his flight training years. People from the town came because they wanted to, not because anyone had organized them. Celeste came in jeans and a plain jacket and stood to one side without drawing attention. She did not bring a photographer. She did not give a speech. Piper placed a drawing she had made next to a jar of white flowers at the base of the memorial. She had drawn the ocean, and just beneath the surface, a light coming upward. She asked her father, in the quiet after the ceremony when most people had moved away, whether he thought her mother Laurel would have been glad. Archer looked at the water for a while. He said that Laurel had spent the last months of her life trying to make sure the truth had somewhere to arrive. He said the truth had arrived. He said yes, he thought she would have been glad. Celeste came to stand beside him before she left. She said again that she had laughed at his pile of metal the first time she saw it, and she said it not to reopen anything but to acknowledge it clearly as a person rather than as a representative of anything. Archer did not offer her absolution or tell her it was fine. He said the evidence had mattered more than the opinion. He said the ocean had not cared whether anyone believed it, and neither had he. He said the truth being home was a better beginning than he had expected. He did not say he had forgiven everything. Some things are not arrived at that quickly, and he was a man who did not perform what he had not yet finished feeling. But he said it was a beginning, and he meant it. Several weeks later, On a Tuesday morning in early summer, Archer walked the beach south of the harbor with Piper beside him. She was carrying the smaller cart now, the one they had made from old bicycle wheels when she had started coming along regularly. The tide had pulled back, and the beach was clean and wide, and the light was the particular low gold of mornings that have not yet committed to the day's full temperature. Piper found a fragment of metal half buried in a sand ridge at the waterline and held it up and asked whether they should keep it. Archer took it from her and turned it over in his hands, examining the weight, the surface texture, the way the light caught the grain. He smiled. Not the rare full kind this time, but a quieter kind. The kind that had more space in it. He slipped it into his jacket pocket and said that not every piece carried a secret, but every piece had once been part of something, and that was worth knowing. They walked on together, the cart wheels leaving two clean lines in the wet sand behind them, the ocean moving at its own indifferent pace alongside them, vast and patient and full of what it had not yet returned.